Good evening. My name is Nicole Alifanti. Thank you so much for learning with CURE tonight. I am one of the co-founders and the president of CURE, which is the Coalition for Understanding Racism Through Education. And you can go to our website at learnwithcure.com to learn more about us. We're a hyper local organization here in Larchmont and Mamaroneck. We are a nonprofit, but not a 501c3. So our fiscal sponsors are the Larchmont Mamaroneck Lions Club. And we are partnered here tonight with LMC Media, and we're so grateful for the work that they do in our community. I am here with CURE leader Ann Lobu. This panel series was her brainchild, and she was the president of the Board of Education here in Mamaroneck School District, and now she is studying education policy at Columbia University. I'm also here with a new leader to CURE, Gabby Blumberg, and she jumped in and gave many hours to putting these panels together, so we're truly grateful. Gabby, do you want to tell them a little bit about questions?
Sure. So this evening, I'm going to be sort of managing and moderating the chat. And so while we can't see any of you, we do want to hear from you. And if you have any questions or comments along the way, don't save them till the end. Feel free to add them as they come to you in the chat, and I'll just make note of them. And then when it comes time to do the audience Q&A at the end, we'll bring those questions to the panelists. And thanks all for being here.
Thank you, Gabby. So COVID-19 has exacerbated inequity, and it's shown us a deeper truth about racism in our country and in our communities. I want to say too that the two panels we had prior to this, we realized they were just dropping seeds here. I mean, there's so much to understand. So this is our first round of panels, and tonight we're talking about employment. I think the essential question throughout all of these panel series is perhaps a question that has been recurring throughout our country's history, which is why should we collectively care about equity, undoing racism and oppression? And why do communities like ours too often view growing equity as a zero-sum game or a move that might create a loss instead of a huge cultural and even economic long-term gain? So tonight we're honored to have Carola Bracco, Maureen Hussein, and Janet Rolon or Janet Fry, however you know her. They'll tell you about themselves and what they do, and we will discuss employment together. I think Janet is going to start with a little bit of her own personal story. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I like to share my personal story. So my name is Janet, as Nicole said, and I was born in Peru, South America. I came to the US at the age of 21 in 2001 before the attacks on 9/11. I didn't speak English, I didn't have immigration status, and my family was my only safety net. So in the first year of my arrival, I got a job as a house cleaner in Scarsdale, New York. My work schedule was from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., Monday through Friday. Although I was hired as a house cleaner, shortly after my hiring, my employer assigned me more duties. She asked me to cook dinner and do laundry and babysit her 18-month-old baby. My employer paid me $10 an hour, no overtime, let alone benefits. As a newly arrived immigrant, I didn't know what my employer was doing was wrong. For example, adding more responsibilities without discussing it or increasing my pay. So the job got very hard at times, and when she was frustrated with her kids, she would take it on me. She made me feel ashamed of the way I spoke and question my immigration status. So after a year and a half working there, I finally summoned the courage to and told my employer I was quitting. I told her that I couldn't work 12 hours a day or even do all the duties that she had me doing. So she asked to negotiate. And so I told her that I wanted to do only house cleaning 9 to 5 normal hours, Monday through Friday. And I asked for an increased pay, $15 an hour. So she since she wanted me to stay, she accepted it. So for me, fortunately, a little while later, an opportunity presented itself at the Community Resource Center. And today I'm the Deputy Executive Director and overseeing the programs at the CRC, including the Worker Center. It is therefore a particular pleasure for me to be able to speak with all of you today and talk about the persistent problems that affect me personally many years ago and continue to affect domestic workers in Westchester County today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that story, Janet. It's so moving and so important for us to know what you've gone through and also now what you've accomplished. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. So important to put a real human face on all of the issues that we see in our community and really understand personal stories. So now I'd love, after that wonderful beginning, I'd love to turn to Carola Bracco from Neighbors Link.
There, finally? Okay,
There
great.
you go. Okay.
I don't know why it took long. Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel. And I just want to also thank Janet for sharing her story. She really, I think, embodies what it takes to be an immigrant, to be part of the workforce in this country, the tremendous amount of creativity, ingenuity, the amount of smarts, all that it takes in order to be part of the workforce in this country. And then on top of that, to be part of the immigrant workforce. She was able to overcome some pretty significant obstacles. And another important point, I think, that Janet's story really exemplifies is immigrants come to this country with tremendous skills. You know, Janet came with the ability to do the amazing things that she's doing at the Community Resource Center through her work, and certainly underemployed in her job when she first came to the country, and the difficulty it is for people to be able to because of all the challenges they face in the workforce, how difficult it can be to really rise up to your level of expertise. So I think Janet brings to light a lot of those issues. I'm going to share my screen now, so if you give me a moment. Great, excuse me one moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about national immigration policies and how they target the immigrant workforce. I'm going to talk to you for just a slide about Neighbors Link and what our programming is like. And then I'm going to give you a national perspective on immigration and the state and county legislation as well. Excuse me. And then we're going to talk a little bit about ICE enforcement, and I'm going to give you just a glimpse of the cultural awareness training that we do in our organization. So I'm going to have to ask you to hold on just one moment. I'm going to have to get a little water.
That tickle, it's the fall tickle. That's the worst feeling. I now have empathy tickle.
Did you all chat amongst yourselves?
We did. We told jokes. No.
Okay. So the mission of Neighbors Link is to strengthen the whole community through the healthy integration of immigrants. And what I'd like to point out to you is the importance of this term integration, so that understanding that I often think of the term integration as the opposite of the term to assimilate. And when we talk about immigrants assimilating into our community, we're really talking about immigrants becoming just like the people that live in the host community. Often you'll see immigrants change their names. You'll see the extent to which they try to Americanize their names. They try to shed so much of what's part of it's so important in their culture. And so the term integration is a very important term because it really means that we take what's the best and what is special of all the different cultures that live in our community. And I think this is an important distinction as we think about our mission at Neighbors Link, which is to integrate the whole community. At Neighbors Link, we serve about 4,200 immigrants. We run a variety of different programs that include a family center, adult education, which includes ESL and skills training. We have a worker center. We also have an immigration legal practice and a cultural awareness training program where we train about 400 police officers a year, as well as healthcare workers and school district personnel. I'll mention this worker center is a day labor hiring site that includes a hiring site where employers can come and hire workers for day labor, seasonal work, as well as a job bank where those that are looking for higher skilled can come and hire workers. We have a whole about 400 volunteers that work with us at Neighbors Link, and we also have some significant partnerships that are critical to being able to run our programs. We do not do our work all by ourselves. Our partnerships make a big difference. And we're very proud to be named, to be designated by the governor's office as an office for new Americans, in which we receive funding for a variety of programs that help us reach out to the community to provide services. So I'm going to talk a little bit about current immigration policies and how significantly these policies affect the workforce in our community. So one of the first things that I want to highlight is the extent to which we've seen major shifts in our nation's immigration policies. And the first that I think is really important to discuss is in the past, in prior administrations in the White House, what we saw was that those people that were targeted for deportation, it was based on very specific criteria. And only certain people were being targeted for deportation. And those were individuals that had a prior criminal conviction or were deemed a threat to public security, or people who had arrived to this country after January of 2014. So people who had arrived more recently were targets for deportation. Now, with the current administration, what we've seen is the immigration policies in this country have now really become so much more general in terms of who can be deported. So now we see that really anyone can be deported regardless of when they arrived into this country and regardless of any criminal background that they may have, and whether or not there's been any prior conviction. So now what we're seeing is a very wide net being cast on who can be deported. And to tie this all back into our workforce, we have about 11 million undocumented people in this country, a majority of whom are in our workforce. And so they go to work every day and contribute to our economy in a very significant way, but they do that with a tremendous amount of fear and uncertainty. And Janet told you in her story how she was able to get the courage to go to her employer and tell her employer that she wanted a raise and she wanted to get paid overtime. And she also advocated for herself when it came to the responsibilities that her employer was giving her. And that is something that today we are not seeing among such a large portion of the workforce. And the primary reason for that is because our deportation policies now are so much more general that so much of our workforce fears being deported that they are not willing or able or have the courage to advocate for themselves in this way. So we see a tremendous amount of abuse in the workplace related to lack of overtime pay, just the same things that Janet talked about that were her experience, but also certainly exacerbated. In addition to that, this fear of deportation also causes people to be afraid to go to hospitals or to access health care when they're hurt on a job. It makes employers fear using any kind of workers' comp for a hurt employee. So much of our national immigration policies have very definitely negatively impacted our workforce. So I've mentioned that today we are seeing that those that qualify for deportation, or where there can be a focus on deporting them, is so much more general. The net has been cast so much wider on who can be deported. There have also been a few additional issues that are deeply affecting the families that live in our community, who make up such an important part of our workforce. The policy at the border in the past was that even if people were coming into this country, they could come into the country while they awaited their court date with immigration, and while they advocated through their attempt to stay in this country with some kind of documentation. And so if they were stopped at the border, they were released and allowed to come into this country, often reuniting with family members. The end of that program, where now we see so many more people being put into detention, has had a significant impact on people coming into this country and the extent to which they can feel confident that they can find some kind of refuge in this country. One of the other things that I'm going to talk about also is expedited removal, which is a very new policy that is being put in place. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I did want to mention the DACA program. You might be familiar with the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And this was a policy put in place by the Obama administration that allowed those who had been brought to this country as children to stay in this country and not fear deportation. It allowed those young people to work in this country, in most states to get a driver's license, and be able to feel comfortable that they were not a priority for deportation. In the current administration, there was an attempt made to rescind DACA and take the DACA program away. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court indicated very clearly that the current administration certainly can end DACA, but the Supreme Court simply said that they didn't do it the right way. And so in their decision, the Supreme Court really gave a roadmap to the current administration on how to end DACA successfully and correctly. And now we see that the administration is putting in place a process so that they can move towards the elimination of DACA. I bring this up because those that have DACA in this country were undocumented individuals who could not work in this country legally, and with DACA, they could work. So now we're going to see a large portion of people that are in the workforce, hundreds of thousands of people that are in the workforce, that when DACA is eliminated, they will suddenly not be able to work. And this is a very important issue for our employers who have spent time training people who might need to replace DACA recipients from among their staff. And so obviously it has a tremendous impact on our workforce. These are some of the immigration policies that have been put in place more recently. Always, I'll either say casting a wider net on who can be deported, or more narrowing very much who's allowed to come into this country. So I'm not going to go through all this in a lot of detail, but expedited removal basically says that people that have been in this country for less than 2 years no longer have any due process, do not get to go in front of an immigration court in most cases, not in all cases, and that a single immigration officer is the sole decision maker. And so those individuals can be removed and deported. Now, let me also indicate another reason why this is so important to our current workforce. So I've talked about the number of people in this country that are undocumented, but really most of the families in this country have individuals with different statuses. So these immigration policies don't just impact the individual who's undocumented, but they impact the whole family unit, even though those individuals might have some kind of status to stay in this country. So imagine a family unit where a father is undocumented and the mother is a naturalized citizen, and they may have one DACA child and they may have another child that was born in this country. All those people in that family are scared to death about the possible deportation of that one member. And when you live in that kind of fear, it completely impacts your ability to work effectively. You're afraid to show up for work you don't show up for work on time. You don't learn English as well. You're just simply not as productive when you have so much happening to you and so many worries and fears. And that's why I think talking about these policies is so important in this setting when we're talking about our workforce. Asylum seekers, people coming to this country that are fearful for their own lives, living in their own country, we have certainly made it more difficult for those individuals to come into this country. And in fact, really the rules now say that if you had to cross another country to come to the United States, you must claim asylum in that country and not in this country. And so again, remember that asylum seekers are often family members that are trying to reunite with other family members. So again, we have our workforce living with a significant amount of fear when and heartbreak when they can't reunite with their family members. I'm just going to keep going. I did want to talk just a little bit about what's going on at the state and county level, because this is more heartening. And my presentations on immigration policy at the national level can be very sad and depressing. And so I want to talk for a minute about what's happening at the state and county level, because here we have seen some protections put in place. Certainly, most of you might have seen that different municipalities over the past year have passed resolutions supporting the immigrant communities, supporting the workforce, and providing some effort to make sure that immigrants who are working in our community and living in our community can have some sense that they have rights and will be protected. The Immigration Protection Act is one way that has happened, where it limits the extent to which local law enforcement can ask people their immigration status, and thereby reducing the extent to which an individual might come in contact with ICE. Also in the state of New York last year, we passed driver's licenses for all New Yorkers, regardless of their immigration status. Again, a very critical issue for those working in New York. Without a driver's license, you can imagine how difficult it is to get to work on time and to hold 2 part-time jobs if that's an issue for your family. So if you're not able to find a full-time job and you want to hold 2 part-time jobs, the only way you're going to be able to get from one job to the other living in Westchester County is if you drive. Your public transportation will not allow you to do that. So having driver's licenses for all New Yorkers is very important. There are 2 proposals, two legislations that are important to note. One is the Excluded and Essential Workers campaign. And this is for those workers that were left out of the federal stimulus package. So you know how everyone received the roughly $1,200 out of the federal stimulus package most recently. Well, there were many who were excluded from that. For one, if they were undocumented. Number 2, if they had a family member that was undocumented. So even if you filed your taxes, you paid your taxes, you have your social security number, you're working, you took care of all those things. But if you listed somebody on your tax return that was an undocumented person in an attempt to pay taxes as you should, then you were, even as a taxpayer, left out of the last federal stimulus package. So this is Excluded Essential Workers campaign is to create a fund. And there's also right to counsel for evictions. That is another legislation that is pending. A couple of the key issues that we're dealing with because of what we see happening in national immigration policies are the separation of families. I don't have to talk too much more about that. I know you've all seen and read about it. And certainly detention facilities and the extent to which they are below par in terms of living, standard of living. And I've just talked about the COVID-19 funds where so many of our workforce has been excluded. And so just to, can I get a check on time? I'm sorry, Ann, you're on mute.
About 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Great. So so here just some of the different things that I've talked about, highlighted on one page for you to see. And I want to mention that this issue of fear of deportation affects our workforce in so many different ways, but it also affects people's ability, for example, comfort level in responding to the census. Even in voting, people that are afraid to go and vote because they're afraid that they might in some way come across immigration. So what I'm going to do now is I'd like to just skip ahead if I could. And in closing, I'd like to give you just a little glimpse of the cultural awareness training programs that we do, just by showing you this one slide that talks about stereotyping. And here we have Snoop Dogg with Martha Stewart. Only one of these two people is a convicted felon. Be careful how you stereotype people. So on that note, I'll stop and pass it along to the next person. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carola. That was so informative, and I can't wait to discuss, ask some questions and discuss that with you later. So next up, we have Maureen Hussein, and she's going to tell us about her work and the work she does with workers.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so grateful to get to learn alongside of you tonight. I'm lucky that in my work with the Worker Justice Center, I often have the opportunity to collaborate with Janet and Carola, and I learn from them every time we do, and certainly learning tonight as well alongside everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, is that visible for everybody? Great. So my name is Maureen Hussein. I'm a staff attorney at the Worker Justice Center of New York. I just want to start with a brief introduction of our organization. We operate statewide with the exception of New York City, so Westchester County and upstate. And we have offices in Rochester, Kingston, and Hawthorne. And our focus is pursuing justice for those denied human rights. In particular, we focus on agricultural workers and people who work in other low-wage industries. And we do that through multi-pronged approach. I'm part of the legal team, and we bring lawsuits on behalf of low-wage workers who are victims of wage theft, or have experienced discrimination, or have had some other workplace abuse. We also do outreach and education to workers so that people get to know their rights, especially as the legal landscape changes over time, making sure that people know what is the latest and what rights they have, what remedies are available, and what services can they access in order to make those rights real? We also have a team that works with survivors of domestic violence and workplace violence. We have an anti-trafficking team that works with survivors of trafficking, as well as doing education to law enforcement and other trainings to community members. And we have an advocacy team that works on legislative reform efforts to try to, push the ball forward and making our legal landscape more just. So what I want to do tonight is give an overview of some of the wage and hour laws that are applicable in New York. There are so many different kinds of laws that bear on employment relationships, including civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of certain protected characteristics like race or sex, laws concerning concerted activity, being able to work together with your coworkers to try to improve conditions, organize, laws concerning health and safety, laws about access to benefits that might stem from your work or your inability to work. And as you can imagine, there's not enough time tonight to discuss all of these laws. So what I'd like to do is just go on a whirlwind tour of some of the major laws that underpin workers' rights in the wage and hour context in New York. In particular, these laws form the basis for how proper wages should be calculated. And along the way, I want to introduce some of the racialized historical context for these laws and how they continue to operate in a racialized manner even now. So I refer to these laws as wage and hour, and you can tell from the name that basically they boil down to what wages are people entitled to for their work, and any restrictions on the number of hours or which hours people can work. The grandfather of these laws, which is still the bedrock of our labor laws in this country, is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which sometimes we just shorten as FLSA. This is a watershed legislation that established the federal minimum wage and the right to overtime pay at time and a half when you work more than 40 hours in a week. This law passed in 1938. It was part of the, a package of New Deal legislative reforms that included a lot of different labor rights legislation. And it may be surprising to learn that in the 1930s, these laws were deeply controversial. And these basic protections are now so deeply embedded in how we understand work in our country that might be surprising. But this law radically changed how employment worked in the United States, at least for some workers, and was very controversial at the time. In 1938, when this law was passed, the minimum wage was 25 cents an hour. It has increased periodically since then, thank goodness. And the current rate is $7.25. It has remained stagnant at that rate since 2009. And I believe that that's now the longest time that we've gone without having the federal minimum wage increase. In many ways, by 1938, this law was a long time coming. There had been years and years of organizing from the labor movement and people trying to improve the working conditions for the American workforce. At the time, millions of children were employed, and people typically worked 6 days a week, even 7 days a week, and 10 to 12 hours per day. So many of the labor reforms that were part of the New Deal were prompted by the Great Depression and the serious financial difficulties that people found themselves in, as well as the dangerous and difficult working conditions of the day. at the same time that people were working these grueling schedules, there was also widespread unemployment because of the Great Depression. And so support for this law was in part due to the idea that reducing each person's individual workload for the week could help to spread employment across more people in the community. As we'll see, this law was a landmark legislation, and it also has some shortcomings. Some of the exclusions that we'll talk about were racially motivated. This law, because it did change the landscape so fundamentally, was challenged repeatedly in the courts. So there are a lot of Depression-era Supreme Court decisions where the justices are really figuring out how to use this law and what is it going to mean in our country. And there are a lot of decisions from that era that talk about how the FLSA should be interpreted broadly because it's a remedial statute, meaning that its intention is to right a wrong. So I've included here a quote that really speaks to me. I think it captures the lofty goals of this law. So this is from a Supreme Court case that came down in 1944, and the justice who wrote the decision said, "We are not here dealing with mere chattels or articles of trade, but with the rights of those who toil, of those who sacrifice a full measure of their freedom and talents to the use and profit of others. Those are the rights that Congress has specially legislated to protect." So these are lofty goals, but the law, even at the beginning, had its shortcomings. Only about 1 in 5 American workers was actually covered at the time that the law was enacted. And even today, after the law has been amended several times, not all categories of labor are covered under the law or covered in the same way. Unfortunately, the legislative history of the FLSA also reveals that much of the rationale for excluding certain segments of the workforce was racial discrimination against Black Americans and a desire to ensure that the social order and the economy could continue to exploit the labor of people of color, even after the abolition of slavery. So the FLSA is this bedrock federal law. It's the law of the land across all of the United States. But we've seen that it has some shortcomings. It creates a floor, and the states and localities are free to bring worker protections up to a higher level within their borders. So certain basic protections are guaranteed by the FLSA. States and municipalities can require greater protections. And New York has certainly done that in many respects with the New York labor law. The New York labor law enshrines many of the same basic protections as FLSA, but in a more inclusive manner and with stronger remedies for workers. So the New York labor law also mandates that employees be paid a minimum wage for each hour, and also that workers be paid at time and a half for hours over 40. But in addition, many workers are entitled to additional compensation. For example, if they work split shifts, meaning maybe they have a morning shift and then they go home for a couple of hours and then they have an afternoon shift at the same employer. Or if the person's workday spans more than 10 hours, they could be entitled to additional compensation under New York state law. New York also has a special series of protections that they became part of the New York labor law through the Wage Theft Prevention Act, which is a fairly recent law aimed at, of course, preventing wage theft from happening in the first place. And it does that by mandating that employers provide certain kinds of written notice to employees at the time that they're hired, and then also every time that they get paid wages. The idea is that by providing a written explanation of what your wages are and how they're calculated and who your employer is, so that if you have questions, you know who to talk to, that should make it much more transparent to workers about whether or not they're being paid legally, to help stop some of these abuses from happening. Because as you can imagine, if it's not clear to someone how their pay is being calculated, it won't be clear whether it's proper or not. So the New York labor law provides remedies for people. You can win money damages if an employer does not follow those requirements to provide you that kind of notice. Both state and federal law allow workers to bring a private cause of action in court. And workers can recover their unpaid wages. They can recover something called liquidated damages, where if an employer did not pay you properly at the time that you were owed wages, then essentially the employer would owe you double. Both of the laws, New York labor law and FLSA, also have a fee shifting provision, which means that a worker who wins in court can also have their attorney's fees and costs paid by the employer. And that's, of course, very meaningful, because otherwise people who may not be able to pay for a private attorney can seek representation. The attorney knows that they might be able to get paid at the end of the case when they prevail for the worker. We talked about how the federal minimum wage is $7.25, and it's been that way for more than a decade. New York State has a higher minimum wage. It's been increasing every year since 2013, with the goal of reaching $15 an hour across the state. Different parts of the state are at different points in that increase. And so right now in Westchester County, the minimum wage is $13 an hour. That's going to go up at the end of this year to $14. And in New York City, the minimum wage is already $15 an hour. Other parts of the state are at $11.80, and it'll go up at the end of the year. So in general, I think it's safe to say that the New York State law is more protective of workers than the federal law at this time. One area that I just wanted to flag, because the New York labor law resembles the FLSA, is with respect to tips. And unfortunately, this practice has both a racialized past and present. Under both the FLSA and the New York labor law, employers can take what's called a tip credit in certain circumstances. So they can pay a tipped minimum wage, meaning a lower cash wage that's paid by the employer, because the employee is regularly receiving money directly from customers in the way of tips. A common example of this would be a server in a restaurant. In New York, there are many different tiers of tipped minimum wages. It depends on the job, what industry you're working in, and it depends on what location you're in within the state. It also depends on the amount of money that you receive in tips as you're working. So just as one example, in Westchester County right now, the tipped minimum wage for food service workers is $8.65 an hour. Compare that to the $13 an hour that most workers are guaranteed to receive from their employers directly. A food service worker would be looking to make that amount, but part of it would come from the employer and part of it would be coming from tips. As a point of comparison, the tipped minimum wage under the FLSA is $2.13. So you can see that some of these these amounts are not really living wages, and they're putting tipped workers at the mercy of the customers in the industries where they work. Tipping as a practice became more widespread after the Civil War, as the hospitality industry in particular looked for ways to minimize wages that had to be paid to workers who had formerly been enslaved. So I'm including a quote here and some links in case anyone is interested in learning more about this. The quote is from this Politico article. And the author said that tipping further entrenched a unique and often racialized class structure in service jobs in which workers must please both customer and employer to earn anything at all. And as you may already be aware, either from your own experience or from recent news articles, this dynamic creates an environment that's just ripe for abuse. It's ripe for harassment, racial profiling, and also wage theft, where it's not clear exactly what compensation is coming from the employer, what's coming from tips, and how does it all even out. Okay, so New York still has some room for improvement, but in many ways, advocates around the state have accomplished some impressive gains in closing the gaps in federal law to address some of the more glaring racial inequities. So just two examples that I want to highlight are the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights and the Farm Laborers Fair Labor Practices Act. So the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights was passed in 2010. If you're keeping track, that's 72 years after the FLSA was passed. And it was the first law of its kind in any state because it included domestic workers in all of the major labor laws that protected workers in other industries. So the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights created a right to overtime pay after 40 hours. And that threshold is 44 hours for domestic workers who live in the employer's residence. It also mandated a day of rest every 7 days. And if a person chose to work on the day of rest, they would be entitled to overtime for all of their hours on that day. It also created a right to 3 days of paid time off per year after the person had been employed for 1 year with that employer. And domestic workers became included in the New York State human rights law, which prohibits harassment and other forms of discrimination. Only last year, a similar piece of legislation was passed in New York with respect to farm workers. So this is now 81 years after the FLSA came down for certain workers. Finally, farm workers in New York have some of the protections that other workers have. So this law went into effect in 2020. Some of the provisions are still phasing in, but it created a right to overtime for farm workers after 60 hours. And similar to the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, there's also a day of rest every week. And if the person chooses to work on their day of rest, then they're entitled to overtime for those hours. It also makes it explicit that farm workers have the right to organize and form unions. And as we've seen throughout the history of labor laws, that right is so essential for people to be able to speak with each other, organize, build power, and advocate to change the conditions in which they're working. There is a carve-out in this Farm Laborers Fair Labor Practices Act that says there's no right to strike or to conduct a concerted slowdown or work stoppage. And the stated reason for that carve-out is the unique nature of farm work. Okay, so we've talked about the federal laws, we've talked about some state laws. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Westchester County has also been active in supporting better working conditions. And it's just important to keep in mind that, if there's a lack of will or agreement on a broader scale at the state level or the national level, that local advocacy can still be a really meaningful avenue for change. And the protections that get put in place at the county level can be really important for people. So just two examples I want to highlight they're kind of companions to each other. The Westchester County Paid Sick Time Law and Westchester County Safe Leave Time Law. Both of these laws were passed in 2018. The Paid Sick Time Law provides up to 40 hours of sick time per year. It could be paid or unpaid depending on the size of the employer. So if the employer has at least 5 employees, then employees are entitled to paid sick time. If it's a small employer, then workers are still entitled to take the time off, but it might be unpaid. But there's no, the employer is not entitled to forbid you from taking the sick time or to retaliate against you for taking the sick time. It just might be unpaid. And I think it's pretty amazing that, this was passed 2 years before the New York State paid sick leave law, and this is in our county. The Westchester County Safe Leave law is similar in that it also provides 40 hours of paid time off. This is different because it's paid no matter what size your employer is. So even if you work for a very small employer, you have up to 40 hours that you can take for these purposes. But the purposes are, fairly circumscribed. It's for testifying in court or attending court proceedings related to domestic violence, human trafficking, or if you need that time to move to a safe location. And these hours of paid time off are in addition to the sick time that you're entitled to under the Westchester County Paid Sick Time Law. So our laws aren't perfect, but they also look pretty good on paper in New York State and in Westchester County. So what's the problem? Even when you have strong laws on the books, which is definitely a necessary ingredient, employers don't always follow the law. When they don't, it's called wage theft, because essentially the workers who in many cases might be low-wage immigrant workers are effectively subsidizing the businesses that they are working for. The employer is essentially pocketing part of their wages for themselves. Wage theft has a disproportionate impact on immigrants. And you might be thinking at this point, what does any of this have to do with immigration? I didn't mention immigration much at all in talking about how the laws function on paper. These bedrock labor protections that we've talked about, the FLSA, the New York Labor Law, the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, the Farm Worker Fair Labor Practices Act, the county laws, they apply regardless of immigration status. An employee who has worked is entitled to pay. Even if that person was not authorized to be employed in the US at the time of performing the work, if somebody actually performed work, then they're entitled to compensation under the law. And remedies are available if someone is not paid what they're entitled to. Still, we see that wage theft is almost a business model in some industries. Especially in low wage or dangerous industries, such as restaurants, construction, farm work, landscaping. And I think there are many reasons for that, but one undeniable reason, I think Carola touched on a little bit, is fear of retaliation often keeps people from speaking up. And often that fear of retaliation is related to immigration issues. Retaliation is illegal under all of these laws that we've talked about. but sometimes it's not enough to know that it's illegal on paper, especially when you know that your employer is already violating other labor laws. And especially when you know that any remedy is going to come after the fact. There's also the lack of financial safety net for many immigrant workers in New York. Many undocumented New Yorkers are not eligible for unemployment insurance. They're more likely to be earning sub-minimum wages, and that keeps workers beholden to their employer, even when there are problems, even when there are known problems with the way that someone is being paid or treated in the job. And all of this means that immigrant workers who may be afraid that their boss will call ICE if they complain, or whose boss may have explicitly said that they will call ICE if they complain, are particularly vulnerable to wage theft. So I want to end just by talking really briefly about a couple of cases that we've had in Westchester County, because this does happen right in our own backyard. So the first case I want to talk about is a restaurant in Westchester. Sometimes wage theft is very blatant, and sometimes it feels like death by 1,000 cuts. And I think this case is notable because it was both. I put in just a few highlights or lowlights, I suppose, from the facts of the case. Some of the employees who worked for this restaurant were paid as little as $25 a day, despite working for 8 to 10 hours. Others were paid minimum wage, but they weren't paid overtime. And some of the employees were also not paid for all of their hours. There were either no records of what hours they worked, or there were falsified records. Some people had illegal deductions made from their paychecks each week. Some people who were tipped workers didn't actually receive all of their tips when they cashed out at the end of the night. And on top of that, people were subjected to a hostile work environment where the owners and managers of the restaurant used racial slurs and subjected people to demeaning treatment. And when workers started to gather together to talk about what was happening and complain about some of the practices at the restaurant, several people were fired. The other case that I wanted to talk about was a landscaping, it's a class action lawsuit against a landscaping company in Westchester County. It's on behalf of 82 workers. And the claims in that case had to do with never getting paid overtime, even though people were working more than 40 hours almost every week. And also something called off-the-clock work, which we see fairly often, unfortunately, in our cases, where people may be paid for an official schedule of 8 hours per day, but in reality, they might be, arriving to work early and doing some work in order to get ready for the time that their boss is starting to pay them at. And then at the end of the day, they're also staying late to do certain other work activities that their boss is not paying them for. And so both of those were part of the case that we're bringing against the landscaping company. I know that this was both simultaneously a lot of information and also just barely glancing on each topic, but I hope it's helpful as an introduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maureen. I mean, it was fascinating history and so interesting to see how policies can differ at the federal, state, and county level, and yet we can still have so many problems despite appearing to have very generous or humane, not even generous, humane policies. For our last but not least speaker, I'd like to turn to Janet Roland, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the local level and get into a little bit more detail about domestic workers in particular.
Thank you so much. And so as I said at the beginning of our conversation, I am the Deputy Executive Director of the Community Resource Center, and I've been with the CRC for over 16 years. So the Community Resource Center is a community-based organization that was founded as the Hispanic Resource Center in 1998. And the CRC promotes promotes the cultural, economic, professional, and educational integration of immigrants in the already established community in Westchester. And we we advocate for those in need. So the CRC is composed of four main departments. We have our case management department that provides social services, the community justice programs that provides legal representation for clients who are dealing with immigration matters, our educational programs that runs our ESL classes, youth leadership, and workforce development trainings, and our worker center that provides vital services for the workforce, for the low-income workforce in Westchester County. So I like to focus this conversation, as you said, and in the domestic work. And I like to talk about it in the sense of the domestic work in the US history, but also the domestic work in our local community and what the issues are, what are we seeing on our end, and how are we providing services to the domestic workers, especially in the times of the pandemic. So I'll share my screen to show you a timeline when it comes to domestic workers. Give me 1 second, please. Can you all see well? Thank you. So this was very informative for me because as an immigrant and arriving in 2001, I thought domestic workers were pretty much immigrants. I didn't think that domestic workers actually has a long history in the US. And at one time, it was predominantly women of color, Black African-American women. So let's start, for example, in 1863, domestic workers were the enslaved, indentured, and the semi-free female laborers of the colonial time. So in the census of 1870, it showed that 52% of the employed women work in domestic and personal service. So the first I would say domestic worker, but domestic servant strike happened in 1881 when the Atlanta Washing Society organized a 10-day strike. These were a group of laundresses that demanded higher wages, but also demanded control of the industry. At this strike, the police arrested and also fined the participants of the strike, but that didn't prevent from the Washing Society to gain 3,000 members. So in 1901, after a Chicago woman went undercover to expose the domestic workers' experiences of mistreatment and long hours with little pay, so some domestic workers were inspired to form a union. So in 1930, domestic worker Laura Lee Jones launched the Domestic Workers Union, which enlisted 75,000 members. And they initiated the campaign that's called Stand Up a Lady for Work. So as Maureen was mentioning, in 1934, or make a reference of the 1930s, the New Deal labor laws, So the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, was passed at the federal level. And this provided protections, the rights to employees in the private sector to form unions, to also do collective bargaining and participate in strikes. And under this law, domestic and agricultural workers were explicitly excluded. And one of the reasons that that were excluded, and Maureen mentioned that it was very controversial at the time, is because Southern Democrats wanted to leave out domestic workers because they didn't want them to gain economic power, especially in Southern states. So it was a compromise in a way. So in 1935, the Fair Labor Standard Act was passed, and this introduced the concept of 44-hour, 7-day work week and established a minimum wage, guaranteed time and a half compensation for overtime, but domestic workers were still excluded from this law. So in 1939, and this happened in Westchester, Bessie Brown, who was a domestic worker, sued her employer after they withheld her wages and they assaulted her when she demanded those wages. She lost her case, but her attorney pointed out that the fact that she sued them was very embarrassing for her employer. So in a way, the case served its purpose. So in 1964, the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 bars employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, but only applies to employers with 15 or more employees. So once again, domestic workers were excluded from this law or from this protection. In 1967, Age Discrimination in Employment Act was passed, and this provided protections to individuals of 40 years of age and up, and but again, only applies to employers with 20 or more employees. So as you know, many domestic workers employers only have one or maybe two domestic workers working for them. So in 1970, the Occupational Safety and Health Act was passed, which created an agency that assures the safe and healthful working conditions for working women and men, and also set up an enforcing standards program and provided training and outreach, education, and assistance to those workers. And same as the National Labor, as the NLRA Act, domestic workers were also excluded from this law. So Maureen mentioned that there was an amendment which was called the Fair Labor Standards Act Amendment. And this amendment gave some protections to domestic workers, but still babysitters and companions of elderly persons were also excluded. And then in 1990, American with Disability Act, you know, this law protects individuals with disabilities from employment discrimination, but like the Civil Rights Act, you know, it applies only to workplaces with 15 or more employees, leaving out most of the domestic workers. So in 1995, the Washington City Papers released a report, and this uncovered a secret system that employed a number of foreign diplomats and members of the World Bank, the IMF, and other international institutions, and who were permitted to bring their helpers, their nannies, you know, their babysitters with them to the US. So we have seen, you know, those type of cases happening locally. And one of them, actually, we partner with Workers Justice, Maureen, actually represented one of those clients, and we were able to bring justice to that person. That domestic worker didn't have access to her documents, wasn't allowed to go to the doctor or even go outside and talk to people. So that was a very egregious case, but that happened in our own county. So in 2007, there was a Supreme Court case, Long Island Care at Home LTD versus Koch. So Evelyn Koch claimed that she was unfairly denied minimum wage and overtime by her employer. Unfortunately, the Supreme ruled against her case. The Supreme Court cited the companionship exception of the amended Fair Labor Standards Act, and which it says that, a domestic worker who works 3 consecutive days, 24 hours shift, and regularly works 70 hours a week for $7 an hour was not entitled to overtime payment, sorry. And this happened in 2007. So now we know that domestic workers are not entitled to overtime. So in 2007, the National Domestic Workers Alliance formed, and the CRC is one of its members, and we usually do work collectively to continue raising the standards of domestic workers, not only at the local or the state level, but nationally. So in 2010, the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights was passed, and it's the first in the country. So which, gave domestic workers the rights to overtime pay, 1 guaranteed day off per week, and all other protections that Maureen explained before. And in 2018, our own county adopted the New York Earned Sick Leave, which provided more protections than what the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights does. So we can see here that in most of these labor laws, women, domestic workers, and farm workers were excluded from protections, and also from ways for them to have some sort of recourse to, denounce discrimination, harassment, etc. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen to go back to. So as we said, domestic workers lack, labor and health protections, and they often face exploitive working conditions. They are vulnerable to abuses because there is no law that protect them from those happening. They also endure verbal and sexual abuse. And the domestic workers that we have now are women of color and also immigrants. So there's another layer when it comes to an immigrant domestic worker, which is the immigration piece that prevents them from seeking protections, especially with law enforcement. So what are the domestic workers asking for? What are we advocating for when it comes to domestic workers? So what they ask for is wages that can cover the New York, standard of living. They also ask for their employers to respect their hours. For example, in the domestic worker practice, employers pay them a flat rate per week, and their hours that they work for them is unlimited. They are not paid overtime, and sometimes, their own breaks are violated. So they don't have any breaks, during the day. They do multiple jobs at one, in one. For example, if they are hired to do house cleaning, they end up doing babysitting and other duties that they weren't hired for and they are not paid for. And also, they work because they are not protected by OSHA, which is the occupational and safety law. So these women are exposed to work with chemicals, and they expose their own health without any sort of regulations of their workplaces. So now, so those were the problems that already existed before the pandemic. And now I'm going to share the story of one of our domestic workers that happened. It happened that I was one day in the office and we still were open, and we got a chance to talk to her. And she explained to me how the pandemic very early in March already was affecting her. So Claudia lives in Mamaroneck. She is 47 years old, and she has her husband and her 2 children. She supports her family as a domestic worker, and she cleans houses in New Rochelle, Larchmont, and Mamaroneck. As you know, New Rochelle was the first city to quarantine, so she immediately lost her job when that happened. So she used to work Monday through Friday, 9 to 4, cleaning different houses every day. And her husband works in landscaping, which is seasonal. And he's usually laid off during the winter. That's something that workers who work in landscaping or construction, they usually get laid off during the winter. So when she works during the winter, her husband helps her with taking care of the children. So her income usually is $800 a week. And that income was very vital, especially when her husband is unemployed. So in March, when she lost her employment, she was worried because she didn't know how else she was going to support her family. And her employer didn't offer any pay for her time off, and she didn't receive any benefits from him. So she lost 50% of her wages very early on in the pandemic. So there are many domestic workers in much worse conditions. So nannies, babysitters, housekeepers, home care workers were the first one to lose their jobs in the pandemic. Some continue working for medical professionals, for example, like doctors, because they needed childcare. So they were forced to work. And when the National Domestic Workers Alliance, NDWA, survey a number of domestic workers, I think it was about 16,000 domestic workers, 84% of them were uncertain if they, can afford groceries next week, for example. 55% were not able to pay next month's rent, and 77% worry about evictions. So when it comes to who is an essential worker, and this is what Carola mentioned during her presentation about the essential but excluded workers. So everyone working during the pandemic is considered an essential worker. And undocumented workers didn't receive any federal aid or even qualify for unemployment benefits. So although domestic workers put their lives on the line to keep all of us safe, they are still not recognized. So most of these workers continue working without any hazard pay, protective equipment, testing, treatment, and healthcare. And still, trying to keep this economy going they are, invisible or forgotten, to say in a way. So the Essential but Excluded Workers campaign is asking the state government to establish a $3.5 billion fund to ensure that the excluded workers get relief that they need to survive the crisis. So just to talk a little bit more about what the CRC does when it comes to domestic workers, in partnership with the National Domestic Workers Alliance and and Cornell University, we provide trainings and we build grassroots organizing with the domestic workers, so then they can ask for more protections to raise their standards and for their work to be recognized. So over the 4 past years, we have met with domestic workers, nannies, house cleaners, home care workers to talk about their problems and to get to know the dangers that they face at work. We also partner with Queens College to do a survey on domestic workers, just to see the chemicals that they use and the chemicals they are provided to do their house cleaning, just to see how those affects their health and sort of like ask for more protection when it comes to healthcare. During that survey, we found out that domestic workers sometimes face sexual abuses, and they are very ashamed to talk about them. They sometimes think that it's okay to allow their employers to do, sexual advances. And so it was very hard how hidden all of this is. And only when you come to have intimate conversations with them, you can find out that because of the lack of protections, the lack of safety net, domestic workers endure dangerous and working conditions. So because of the lack of health care, we found out that domestic workers who lost their jobs and have their kids at home, and they couldn't work from home, they couldn't work remotely, they were experiencing a lot of anxiety, stress. They wanted to have a way to deal with those feelings without mistreating their children, for example, or even their own partners. So our domestic worker leaders, they form their own group that is called Organizadas Somos la Diferencia, which means, we make the difference organized. They together form virtual support groups. And in those support groups, they talk with each other about their feelings, and those support groups are guided by one of the Cornell University personnel, who actually thought that it was important for them to have that resource to deal with the pandemic and the stressors at home. So also NDWA had a coronavirus fund, and they provided $400 to each of our domestic workers. And 50 of our domestic workers were able to get those funds. And this group of domestic workers have reached to 189 domestic workers that we have in Westchester. Unfortunately, there is no data in terms of how many domestic workers we have in New York State. We know that in the US, there's an estimated number of 2.5 million people who work in the domestic work. So,
Janet, thank you so much for that incredible presentation, for the work that you do in our community, and for your brilliance, frankly, in bringing all of these issues to light and educating us tonight. we only have a few minutes left, really, about 5 minutes. We've had a wealth of information from our esteemed and knowledgeable panelists. We invite you to send us your questions. I'll try to kick this off by asking what's on my mind, which is, what can we do to help? How can we help? I mean, many of us employ nannies and house cleaners and landscapers and other workers. We eat at restaurants where we're served by, again, essential workers. What should we be doing as a community beyond, supporting some of our local charities? What should we be doing to make our community a more equitable and fair place for the people who are, whose parents go to school with, are the parents of the children in our schools. They're shopping in the store with us. They're all around us. What should we be doing?
So one thing I can suggest that because of the pandemic has hit all of us in many different ways, emotionally and also financially, we ask employers to check on the domestic workers to see how they're doing. And if they need resources, connect them with resources. If their budget allows them to pay them for 1 day or 2 days off, please do so. That could be very significant for that domestic worker family. And let's not forget that domestic workers have their own children. And we haven't even talked about that, that how is to raise children, from another person. So it's important to check on them and see, how they're doing. They would really appreciate that.
Thank you. Maureen or Carola, do you have any other suggestions for what we can do?
Sure. I think that Janet touched on it. It's really important to talk about pay, hours, overtime, paid time off, vacation time, all these things that we might take for granted from an employer. Should also be offered to the people that work in people's homes. And that rarely happens. So certainly during the pandemic, if a domestic worker had to stay home and wasn't able to come in to clean, I know that we did a campaign to make sure that all employers fought to pay their domestic workers even when they weren't coming to the house. So it's not just about giving them time off so that they can take care of their children and do things like that, but it's also paid time off. Imagine if you didn't get paid time off, and you had to take care of a variety of things. And I think these things need to be on the table as rights and be demanded and insisted on. And by the way, the other thing that one of the things that I think we need to watch out for is statements when, oh, she's part of my family. I love her. She loves my children. I give her our clothing. I give her our food when we have leftovers, delicious food and things like that. All of that is very nice. But the bottom line is you have to pay people, pay them fairly, and give them certain rights for paid time off and things like that they need in order to be able to survive. So a flag is actually, oh, she's part of our family. Mm-hmm. And I know we mean it, but that doesn't mean that person should not also get paid and be treated with certain very important rights.
Gabby, do we have any questions, comments coming in?
We have a comment here, which is really interesting from Colleen. It's interesting that if a homeowner sponsors a nanny and files to get permanent resident status for her, all the normal worker protections, for example, vacation pay, workers' comp, health insurance, etc., have to be provided, but the government won't offer them or ensure that those workers receive them, which is just a very interesting comment. But that's all that we've gotten.
I did not know that. And do you have anything else that you want to add? I have like a million
I
things.
know, me
Again,
too.
like this is, these panels, these panels are
Blow
certainly,
your mind.
yeah, every time we end one, we're like, yep, we're going to have to do this round again, with a deeper look and more questions. And, but a lot of mind blows. I mean, one takeaway is that in 82 years, the minimum wage went from 25 cents to $7.25 in 82 years. Am I doing that math correctly? 1938 to now,
Yes.
right? So even if it had gone up 25 cents a year, it would be at $20, which is a decent minimum wage, right? I mean, I know high school babysitters get $20 an hour. If you leave them home on a night when you run to a wedding and you leave them from 5 to 1 in the morning, they score. They do really well. So it's like that number just flabbergasted me. And I would love to get deeper into the history of how we don't see some workers and why, and how that's through a racial lens. But I also think I just want to add that I do believe that if we have the facts, especially around domestic workers, the fact that even many people in our community have 2-income households, those incomes fortify their very beautiful lifestyles. And those lifestyles are not able to happen unless they have nannies and housekeepers and landscapers. And so it's just interesting to me the domino effect and just the way we rely on people, but we don't respect that they deserve the same things that we deserve. And I just feel like ultimately when you pay people well and you take care of people, they give back to the community, and vice versa. And it's interesting to me that when we have these domestic workers talks, and we had one before, they're the least attended, they're the hardest conversations to have sometimes. And it's because it's so embedded in our culture and our community. And we really like looking at it as literally it's right here, And so, but I actually think it's a really liberating conversation. And I would love to see Mamaroneck over time and Larchmont form a movement where we are all offering our domestic workers contracts, and we're doing it together, and that it's not cool if you don't. So, to put it very, lightly. But so I really want to thank all of you, Maureen, Janet, Carola. Your depth of knowledge in your field is truly mind-bending. Your generosity is as well. And you will be back. I'm telling you, you will be back because we really do want to expand on these conversations and see how we can get into the nuances of them and how we can take more action. So if any of you have a last word, please take it. Otherwise, thank you everyone who came to see us. Our next panel is November 12th. We're going to dig into immigration, which we wish we had done first because it clouds a lot of these conversations in a good way. And that's going to be mind-blowing because immigration is a tricky subject for everyone. And then we've added a 5th panel where we will have elected officials come and go back over these topics. So that could be a good time maybe to throw in some questions and nuances as well. And that'll be November 18th. So thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
go out and
Thank
vote.
you.
Go vote.
Go
Yes.
vote.
Vote.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.